If you listen closely to silence, it is rarely silent. In the hush of the desert, sand grains sigh against one another, telling stories of queens, generals, and gamblers who played for empires. Tonight, we begin among them, in Alexandria, jewel of the Nile, where marble gleamed like moonlight and ambition perfumed the air. The year is 51 BC. The Mediterranean world hums with gossip, for Egypt, ancient, glittering, and far too rich for comfort, is without a clear ruler. The old pharaoh, Ptolemy XII Auletes, has died, leaving behind debts, a dubious reputation for flute playing, and 2 children who are supposed to share a throne. One is a boy of about 10, Ptolemy XIII, and the other, the one history will remember, is his elder sister, Cleopatra VII Philopator. Picture her not yet a legend. She is perhaps 18, clever-eyed, already fluent in half a dozen tongues, and aware, keenly aware, that the gods have given her both beauty and danger in equal measure. She walks through corridors where painted lotus blossoms fade under time's breath, where Greek courtiers debate poetry while Egyptian priests mutter prayers older than pyramids. Her sandals whisper across inlaid floors as though she's treading water between 2 worlds, the Hellenistic and the Pharaonic, reason and ritual. Outside the palace, Alexandria breathes. The harbor swells with sails from Rhodes, Rome, and Cyrene. Spices and philosophy mingle in the streets. At dusk, fishermen haul nets that glitter like spilled stars, and philosophers argue about the shape of virtue in doorways sticky with honeyed wine. If one must fall asleep somewhere in antiquity, I'd argue Alexandria makes a fine choice: warm breezes, distant lyres, and only a mild chance of assassination. Within the royal compound, though, the air trembles with politics. Cleopatra's advisors whisper that her brother's regents plan to edge her out. They use the boy's youth as a puppet string. The courtiers play both sides, measuring loyalty by the thickness of gold necklaces. And so the stage is set, the first act of a drama that will, in time, entangle Rome itself. But let's slow down, because history too often gallops. Imagine instead the flicker of an oil lamp as Cleopatra studies by its light. Scrolls lie open, treatises on astronomy, papyri of Homer's verses. She traces the constellations' names in Greek and in the older tongue of the Nile, murmuring them like lullabies. Outside her window, the lighthouse of Pharos throws its beam across the dark sea, a steady heartbeat guiding sailors home. In those nights, perhaps she dreamed of what a queen might be. Not merely a throne ornament, but a mind sharp enough to outthink generals. The priests said the pharaoh was the living Horus. The Greeks said she was a monarch in the style of Alexander. Cleopatra decided she could be both. Her sleep is interrupted one humid dawn by shouts in the courtyard. The regents have moved. The guards' loyalty has shifted like sand in wind. She's told delicately that her presence in the palace is no longer comfortable. Exile arrives not with swords but with courtesies. She packs what she can carry and rides eastward into the Nile Delta, her followers dwindling, the horizon shimmering like a mirage of lost crowns. For a time, she disappears from the marble world. The city continues to gossip about taxes, about Rome, about that scandalous poet who insists love is a military campaign. Yet the sand remembers her footsteps. Somewhere in the reeds, the young queen plots her return. Let your mind drift there for a moment. Hear the slow flap of her barge's sails, smell the sweet rot of lotus blossoms in the marsh. The oars dip rhythmically, like breathing. The water mirrors clouds the color of beaten copper. Cleopatra leans over the rail, thinking not of love, despite what later poets claim, but of logistics, gold reserves, mercenary loyalties, routes to the border of Syria where she might gather support. We are taught to imagine history as sudden, battles, decrees, betrayals erupting overnight. In truth, it moves like the Nile itself, steady, looping, occasionally flooding but always flowing onward. And tonight, as you breathe slowly, that river carries us toward the next bend, where the current will bring another wanderer from the west, a Roman whose ambition gleams as sharply as the Egyptian sun. For now, close your eyes and picture the horizon widening. The reeds part. The desert exhales. Somewhere beyond, sails catch a foreign wind. And there is Julius Caesar. History, like the tide, loves to bring opposites together. Cleopatra, young, exiled, brilliant, is one shore. Julius Caesar, seasoned, powerful, and mildly exhausted by politics, is another. Between them, the Mediterranean rolls like an ancient dice, deciding which empire's shadow will lengthen next. Picture Rome in those years. The Republic wheezes like an old lion after a feast. Senators glare across the marble hall as though their eyebrows alone could stab rivals. Caesar has just triumphed in civil war against Pompey the Great, that once unshakable pillar of Roman pride. Pompey fled to Egypt seeking safety. Egypt, ever the opportunist, decided that loyalty was negotiable. Ptolemy Xi's advisors, eager to please Rome's new master, executed Pompey upon his arrival, an offering meant to impress Caesar. They misjudged the man. When Caesar lands in Alexandria, his sandals touch sand still warm from blood. The head of Pompey, preserved in a jar like a grotesque gift, is presented to him. Caesar recoils, not from squeamishness, but from insult. The act reeks of cowardice and poor diplomacy. He came seeking order. Instead, he finds chaos disguised as courtesy. He takes residence in the royal palace, that sprawling maze of columns and perfumed courtyards. Outside, the city murmurs uneasily. Two monarchs, both claiming the throne. Two armies, both restless. And now, an aging Roman general sleeping under their roof. Even the cats, those eternal Egyptian gods in fur, pause to blink at the absurdity. Cleopatra, still in exile near the eastern border, hears the news within days. Caesar, the man who holds Rome in the palm of his hand, has arrived in her city. For her, it's not simply opportunity, it's inevitability. She knows stories from Homer, how gods enter mortal affairs disguised, how fortune favors those who act boldly under moonlight. She decides, in her steady and practical way, that she must meet him. Night drapes over the palace. A soft, salt breeze creeps inland from the sea. Somewhere in the harbor, a small boat glides through the water, carrying a single bundle, large, rug-shaped, suspiciously human-sized. The legend is famous. Cleopatra smuggled herself into Caesar's presence rolled up in a carpet. Historians debate whether it was truly a carpet, or perhaps a laundry sack, less glamorous but more practical. Still, as bedtime stories go, the image is irresistible, the bundle unrolled before the world's most powerful man, and from it, the queen herself, radiant, poised, smelling faintly of cedar oil and victory. Caesar, it is said, laughed, not mockingly, but in delighted disbelief. He admired cleverness, even when it arrived wrapped in woven wool. Here was a ruler who thought in strategies, not tears. Here was someone who played the same game he did. Their conversation that night would alter the axis of empires. No one recorded the exact words, though countless poets have filled in the gaps with honeyed guesses. But imagine the cadence, her calm Egyptian Greek against his gruff Latin, the clink of amphorae being set aside, the distant cry of gulls beyond the window. Two minds circling one another, testing, measuring, finding unexpected harmony in ambition. Days become weeks. Caesar adjudicates Egypt's civil quarrel, and by degrees, his sympathies lean toward Cleopatra. Perhaps it is her intelligence, perhaps her political sense, perhaps, as cynics mutter, her charm. Whatever the reason, he declares that she and her brother will rule jointly, though it's clear to everyone which sibling holds the real gravity in that arrangement. Naturally, Alexandria erupts. The boy-king's regents raise arms. The Roman garrison fortifies the palace. Outside, chaos swells. Smoke stains the sky. The people chant, half in protest, half in sheer confusion. Egypt, after all, has survived foreign rulers before. It knows when the wind changes direction. Inside the palace, Caesar paces like a soldier trapped inside a chessboard. Cleopatra, by his side, watches the city she loves tear at its own seams. Still, in the quiet between crises, they talk. About governance, philosophy, the oddities of Egyptian astronomy. She shows him papyrus charts of the Nile's flooding. He explains Roman engineering with hands that have built more bridges than most men have crossed. History remembers them as lovers, but perhaps, at least at first, they were colleagues in curiosity. Two insomniac minds sharing candlelight and strategy. And yet, even candlelight has shadows. War soon storms through Alexandria's streets. Caesar's troops are outnumbered, his position precarious. The palace becomes a fortress, its courtyards echoing with orders barked in Latin. Cleopatra remains within, calm amid the tumult, her presence both defiance and faith. Outside, fire licks the wooden ships of the Alexandrian fleet. Somewhere, in that same inferno, parts of the great library may have burned, the light of centuries dimmed by human folly. In the smoke and shouting, a single thought persists: survival. Cleopatra and Caesar, bound now by circumstance and by the strange intimacy that danger breeds, must find a way to end the siege. Reinforcements arrive just in time, slicing through the enemy ranks. The young Ptolemy XIII flees to the Nile, only to drown in its waters, swallowed by the very river that once cradled his ancestors' glory. When the battle's clamor fades, the dawn smells of wet ash and victory. Alexandria stirs again, blinking, bruised but breathing. In its heart, the queen reclaims her throne. She is 21. The marble floors gleam again, the banners are raised. Beside her stands the Roman who made it possible, a foreign ally who will soon return home, but not before leaving behind both a legacy and a child. As the palace servants sweep away the last traces of siege dust, the queen looks toward the harbor. The sea is calm again, pretending nothing happened. Caesar prepares to sail westward, his mind full of Senate politics and Egyptian perfume. And as his ship pulls away, Cleopatra watches from the balcony, her expression unreadable. Empires are chessboards, and she has just survived her opening gambit. But every gambit leads to a mid-game. And in that mid-game, another Roman waits, a man far younger, far more dangerous, and far more susceptible to the music of the Nile. To be continued. Section 3. The Golden Boy of Rome. The waves that carried Julius Caesar home also carried whispers. In Rome, the stories spread like spilled wine. The great general had taken an Egyptian queen as his consort. She was said to be half goddess, half sorceress, and entirely inconvenient to the Roman Senate. The old men of the Forum wrung their hands over such things, while the poets, naturally, found them thrilling. Meanwhile, Cleopatra, once again secure in her palace, walked through the echoing halls of Alexandria as if retracing the steps of a dream she'd almost lost. The marble floors had been scrubbed of soot, though the scent of smoke still lingered faintly, like memory itself. Outside, the city hummed its eternal chorus, vendors hawking figs, donkeys braying, scholars debating in shaded courtyards. Life, irrepressible, resumed. She ruled now not as a co-monarch but as pharaoh, sole sovereign, robed in gold-threaded linen and the self-possession of one who has seen kingdoms teeter and lived to straighten the crown afterward. The priests resumed their hymns, the bureaucrats resumed their ledgers. The Nile resumed its rhythm, swelling and receding as it had since time began. And soon, Another rhythm joined it, the cry of an infant. Cleopatra bore a son, Ptolemy Caesar, nicknamed Caesarion. Little Caesar. His very existence was a statement, half divine and half diplomatic. The Egyptians hailed him as the child of Isis and Ra reborn. The Romans, less poetically inclined, saw him as a complication. But Cleopatra saw him as legacy. When she held the child, the lamplight shimmered on his tiny bracelets. She spoke softly to him in Greek, in Egyptian, sometimes even in the broken Latin she'd learned from Caesar. "You," she might have murmured, "are the thread that will bind two worlds, if they do not strangle each other first." But fate, ever capricious, began already to weave darker strands. In 44 BC, word arrived from across the sea, shocking, unbelievable, but undeniable. Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, conqueror of Gaul, had been assassinated. In the Senate chamber, no less, beneath the marble gaze of Pompey, by men who fancied themselves saviors of the Republic. Cleopatra, upon hearing, is said to have neither wept nor raged, but simply stared at the Nile for a long, unbroken silence. She knew what followed assassinations, power vacuums, and the men who rushed to fill them. And there, emerging from the blood and oratory of Roman politics, stepped the golden boy, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son. Barely 19, pale as marble, with eyes that missed nothing. He called himself Caesar's heir, though many doubted him at first. Rome, after all, had seen plenty of would-be heirs. But Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, had a talent for patience, and patience, as Cleopatra well knew, was rarer than genius. Yet he was not the only contender. Another Roman, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend and general, held the loyalty of the legions. Antony was everything Octavian was not: broad-shouldered, loud, fond of wine, laughter, and spectacle. He saw himself as heir in spirit if not in parchment. Rome divided itself neatly between the two, youth and veteran, scholar and soldier, restraint and riot. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra watched from afar as if through a veil of sand. She had lost her Roman ally, her protector, perhaps even her equal. Yet her mind, honed by survival, began to measure possibilities once more. Which of these new Caesars might understand Egypt's worth? Which could be drawn to the Nile's glittering promise? Years passed in the slow, golden rhythm of the floodplain. The boy Caesarion grew, taught by Greek tutors to reason, by Egyptian priests to revere. His mother grew quieter, her laughter more measured. Sometimes, on evenings when the light pooled red across the harbor, she'd climb the palace roof and watch the ships drifting westward, whispering to herself as if rehearsing an argument for a future that hadn't yet arrived. And then, one such evening, a new fleet appeared on the horizon. Not as conquerors, but as envoys. Mark Antony had come to Alexandria. He arrived not in armor but in a pageant so theatrical that even the Alexandrians, no strangers to grandeur, stopped to stare. Gold-burnished prows, purple sails, musicians, dancers, and rumors preceding him like a fanfare. Antony had come to meet the queen, to discuss Rome's eastern provinces, to negotiate, as he put it, matters of mutual profit. Cleopatra, who had long ago mastered the art of first impressions, chose her stage carefully. She did not receive him in the palace, nor in the temple, but upon a barge sailing up the Cydnus River. The vessel was draped in silk, scented with incense, and lit by hundreds of lamps that shimmered like fireflies. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Isis, the goddess of life and magic. Antony, for all his bluster, stood speechless. Later he would laugh and boast that he had captured the queen's heart, but anyone watching might have suspected the reverse. Cleopatra knew performance as strategy. She knew that in the theater of politics, the one who writes the script rarely loses the scene. And so began another partnership, part alliance, part romance, part wager with destiny. Antony lingered in Alexandria long past diplomatic necessity. Together they feasted, hunted, debated, laughed, plotted. Cleopatra saw in him a man of great appetites but also, occasionally, great loyalty. Antony saw in her a queen whose intelligence dazzled him more than her jewels. Yet beneath their laughter, the world beyond the palace walls kept shifting. Rome, that restless mistress, tolerated no long absences. Octavian, across the sea, was consolidating power with quiet precision. Cleopatra and Antony would soon have children of their own. The Nile would bloom again, as it always does. But somewhere in the west, the tides of Rome were turning cold and inevitable. Still, for now, in the amber glow of Alexandria's twilight, they lived as gods might have dreamed, surrounded by music, wrapped in silk, and unaware that their golden season was already beginning to fade. As the queen drifted to sleep one night beside her Roman general, she dreamed not of conquest, but of calm water. Yet history, ever impatient, was already stirring. Because in Rome, Octavian was preparing to play his next move. History, when viewed too quickly, looks like thunder, sudden, loud, and absolute. But if you slow it down, as we do here in the hush before sleep, you'll notice it begins as a whisper. A whisper of strategy in a marble hall. A letter sealed with wax. A glance that lasts one moment too long. That's how storms begin. Rome, in those uneasy years, had grown tired of its own victories. After Caesar's death, the Republic's old bones creaked under the weight of ambition. The so-called Second Triumvirate, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, was meant to restore order. 3 men dividing a world as if it were a vineyard. But alliances in Rome were written in sand, and the Mediterranean winds had opinions of their own. Octavian, ever deliberate, took the west, Italy, Spain, Gaul. Antony, the seasoned soldier, took the east, Greece, Asia, Egypt. Lepidus was given Africa, more as a courtesy than a command. At first, it seemed tidy. But tidy arrangements seldom last long when pride sleeps uneasily beside power. In the east, Antony thrived, or appeared to. He governed from Alexandria more often than from Rome, and why not? The air was warm, the wine better, and Cleopatra, well, Cleopatra was Cleopatra. Together they ruled like a legend already half aware of its ending. Banquets glittered, scholars found patronage, and coins were struck bearing their entwined profiles. To the Alexandrians, it was golden. To the Romans, scandalous. Back in Rome, Octavian was patient but not passive. He fed the Senate careful morsels of outrage, Antony's dalliance, his neglect of Roman duties, his indulgence in foreign decadence. Each rumor was a chess move, positioning the young heir as the sober guardian of Roman virtue, while painting his rival as a love-struck deserter. And oh, how the Senate adored being scandalized. They muttered of Antony's feasts where gold cups were melted after a single use, of Cleopatra's alleged claim to divine worship, of children named for the sun and moon. Some of it was true, some invented, but the distinction mattered less than the impression. In politics, as in dreams, perception is everything. Meanwhile, Antony, ever the soldier, believed he could outfight slander. He marched north, waged campaigns in Armenia, and returned to Alexandria in triumph. Cleopatra met him in regal splendor, her eyes bright, her mind sharper still. Together they staged what history calls the Donations of Alexandria, a lavish ceremony where Antony proclaimed territories for Cleopatra's children, crowning her Queen of Kings. It was theater, yes, but also politics, a statement that Rome no longer defined the world alone. The Nile, once again, dared to rival the Tiber. When word of this reached Octavian, he smiled. The storm he'd been courting had found its thunder. He summoned the Senate. He read aloud a supposed copy of Antony's will, whether genuine or forged, none can say. In it, Antony allegedly requested burial in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. Gasps rippled through the marble chamber. The senators, who loved outrage as others loved dessert, were horrified. A Roman general, they exclaimed, wishing to lie forever in foreign soil? Enslaved by an Eastern queen? Octavian nodded solemnly, as if this news wounded him personally. Then he suggested, reluctantly of course, that such betrayal could not go unanswered. Rome, it seemed, must act to save her honor. Thus was war declared, not against Antony by name, but against Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt and enemy of the Roman people. A clever phrasing, for it framed the conflict as a matter of foreign defense, not civil war. Octavian had weaponized patriotism, and the Senate, pleased with its own righteousness, marched willingly into his narrative. Back in Alexandria, Antony received the news with a mixture of fury and fatalism. He wants Egypt? He growled to Cleopatra. Then he'll have to come and take it. Cleopatra listened, her expression unreadable beneath cold darkened eyes. She'd seen this script before. Rome did not fight wars, it absorbed them. But retreat was never in her nature. Together they prepared, summoning fleets, fortifying ports, gathering allies from Greece to Syria. The queen oversaw supplies herself, moving through the shipyards in plain linen rather than royal silk, her voice calm, her orders precise. The soldiers whispered that she was more god than woman, perhaps because gods, too, must hide their fear. And so the stage was set for one of history's final grand duels, not just of armies, but of philosophies. Rome's iron discipline against Egypt's radiant defiance. Logic against allure. Empire against dream. The fleets met near Actium, a quiet inlet off the coast of Greece, where the sea seemed almost too calm for what followed. The year was 31 BC, and the Mediterranean, ever the gossip, would talk of that day for centuries. As dawn broke, Cleopatra's ships glowed with gilded prows, purple sails swelling like bruises in the wind. Antony's legions stood ready, seasoned but weary. Across the bay, Octavian's admiral Agrippa maneuvered his squadrons with surgical precision. Trumpets blared, oars splashed, and the air filled with the rhythmic thunder of men rowing toward destiny. But battles, like dreams, seldom unfold as intended. Smoke thickened, signals blurred. Cleopatra's flagship, surrounded and vulnerable, veered from formation. Historians still debate the reason: fear, miscommunication, or strategy. But Antony, seeing her sails turn south, followed without hesitation. Love, or loyalty, or simple exhaustion, whatever the cause, his fleet broke apart. The battle was lost not in blood, but in decision. When the sun set, Octavian's banners fluttered victorious over the waves. Antony and Cleopatra, their remaining forces scattered, fled once more to Alexandria, the city that had seen their rise and would soon witness their fall. That night, as the desert wind sighed through the palace arches, Cleopatra stood at the window overlooking the harbor. The torches below flickered like dying stars. She could smell salt and defeat in the air. Behind her, Antony sat silent, staring at his hands as though the lines of fate might still be rewritten there. The queen reached out, briefly touching his shoulder. "The Nile," she whispered, "always floods again." But even the Nile could not wash away what was coming. Far across the sea, Octavian was already sailing eastward, with an army, a purpose, and the calm certainty of a man who had decided what history should remember. There comes a point in every empire's story when even the marble seems to sigh. In Alexandria, that sigh was soft but unmistakable. The palm leaves along the palace walls barely stirred, the harbor slept uneasily. The air was heavy, as though the sky itself hesitated to speak of what it knew was near. Cleopatra had seen wars before. She had watched kingdoms crumble like clay and rise again in new colors. But this war, this one, felt final. The kind of ending that even the gods watch in silence. Octavian's legions had crossed from the west. Their discipline was quiet, terrible, methodical. They moved like an eclipse, swallowing light without hurry. Messengers came breathless to the queen, each bearing worse tidings than the last. One by one, the outposts surrendered. Grain stores emptied. Allies vanished into dust. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Within the palace, Cleopatra walked through the colonnades in measured steps. She had dismissed all but her most trusted attendants. Her hair, coiled beneath a gold diadem, gleamed under the oil lamps. Around her, the courtiers whispered prayers, as if sound itself might break her composure. Antony, ever the soldier, tried to rally what was left of his honor and his troops. He drilled the men at dawn, though many lacked weapons, and more lacked will. His voice still boomed across the courtyards, but its echo came back thin, like the voice of a ghost calling to itself. At night, the queen and her Romans sat together by the window, watching the harbor flames reflected in the black water. Between them stretched a silence full of everything unspoken, hope, regret, and the strange peace that sometimes comes when there is nothing left to lose. Cleopatra had sent envoys to Octavian. They returned with polite vagueness, which was worse than insult. The Roman would grant her no terms but unconditional surrender. She smiled faintly when she heard this, as though amused by the predictability of men who confuse power with permanence. "Rome," she murmured, "believes the world ends where its legions march." And yet she knew it was not pride that sustained her now, it was dignity. There is a difference. Pride is noisy, demanding applause. Dignity is quiet, like breath held before dawn. As Octavian's army approached the city, Antony's remaining fleet deserted him. In desperation, he gathered his last loyal guard and rode out to meet the enemy. The battle was brief, more a gesture than a contest. Dust rose, swords flashed, and by midday it was over. When word reached Cleopatra that Antony had fallen on his sword, she did not cry out. She merely closed her eyes. Moments later, a soldier came running. Antony was not dead yet, but dying, bleeding in the shadow of the mausoleum she had prepared for herself. She ordered him carried there. They met once more beneath the half-finished dome, sunlight pouring through the open roof. The air smelled of plaster and myrrh. Antony, pale and trembling, tried to speak. She silenced him with a hand against his cheek, her own tears catching the light. "Do not mourn," he whispered. "This is how Rome ends for me. And begins for me," she said softly. He died with his head in her lap, as the workers outside continued to hammer stone, building eternity, as one life quietly left it. When Octavian entered Alexandria soon after, the city did not resist. Its gates opened as if tired of defiance. The conqueror rode through streets still lined with marble and memory. Cleopatra, hearing the cheers that greeted her enemy, straightened her crown. She had decided she would meet him not as a prisoner, but as a queen. The meeting was formal, careful, and, on Octavian's part, oddly respectful. He found her in a small audience chamber, draped in plain linen, no jewels, no theatrics. Her eyes were calm, her voice low. She asked for the safety of her children. Octavian, who fancied himself merciful, promised that they would live. He did not, however, promise that she would. After he left, Cleopatra sat for a long time in silence. Her handmaidens, Iras and Charmian, stood beside her but did not speak. The queen's thoughts were far away, beyond marble, beyond empire, beyond the reach of Rome. That night she ordered a simple meal. She ate little, only figs and bread. The air smelled faintly of incense, sharp and sweet. Somewhere outside, a nightjar called once and fell silent. Then, she asked for the basket. Legend says it contained an asp, Egypt's sacred cobra, symbol of divine royalty and rebirth. Whether that was true or poetic invention, none can say. But we know this much: she did not flinch. When Octavian returned the next morning, he found the door barred from within. It was forced open to reveal the queen lying upon her couch, serene, her robes arranged neatly, a faint smile upon her lips. At her side, her two faithful handmaidens had followed her into eternity. Octavian stood for a long moment, silent. Even he, the master of calculated calm, seemed moved. He ordered her buried with the honors of a queen, beside Antony, as she had wished. And so ended 3,000 years of pharaohs. With a whisper, not a roar. The world shifted quietly that day. The Nile flowed on, indifferent yet eternal. The library's last scrolls gathered dust. The temples watched the stars and kept their secrets. In Rome, Octavian would soon take a new name, Augustus, the first emperor. The Republic was dead, though its ghost would walk the centuries. But in Egypt, in the dreams of its people, Cleopatra lived on. They said the asp had carried her not to death, but to transformation. The serpent's bite was but the door between worlds. The last pharaoh, they whispered, had returned to the gods she'd served. And perhaps, if you listened closely to the desert at night, you might still hear her voice, a whisper over the dunes, amused, unbroken, and timeless. Yet this is not quite the end of our story. For history, like sleep, never ends, only changes form. The sand remembers not just Cleopatra, but the echoes that came before her, and the shadows that came after. And in those echoes, we find more tales, of knights, kings, and empires that rose from her ashes. The desert remembers silence differently than we do. To us, silence is absence, the end of a song. But to the desert, silence is simply the continuation of sound too ancient to hear. After Cleopatra's passing, Egypt exhaled, softly, as though releasing 1,000 years of royal breath. Octavian, now Augustus, stood on the deck of his flagship as it glided down the Nile. The water shimmered bronze beneath the lowering sun. In the distance, the pyramids kept their watch, indifferent to the small dramas of mortals. Rome had claimed Egypt, but the land itself remained inscrutable, its soil older than victory, its people fluent in survival. Augustus ordered temples repaired, taxes restructured, scribes to record, soldiers to guard. He was not cruel, only thorough. To him, empire was a system, not a passion. Where Antony had loved, Augustus administered. It was, in its way, more enduring. In time, Egypt became Rome's granary, the empire's golden stomach. Ships left Alexandria heavy with grain that would feed citizens from Gaul to Judea. The old gods lingered, worshipped quietly beside shrines to Jupiter and Venus. The priests adapted their hymns, the merchants adapted their ledgers. Alexandria itself remained brilliant, a city of learning and light, though its library had long since burned to embers. Somewhere in the city's quieter districts, Cleopatra's children lived under watchful eyes. Caesarion, the son of Caesar, had not lived long. Augustus ensured that no rival sons rose beside his. But the twins she bore to Antony, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, survived. The boy faded from history, but the girl, Selene, would carry the embers of Egypt westward. She was taken to Rome, not as a prisoner but as an ornament, raised in the household of Octavia, Antony's sister. The Romans, fond of pageantry, adored her exotic grace, her gold-threaded hair, her silent dignity. Yet within her, Egypt still glowed, a quiet defiance hidden behind Roman manners. Years later, she would marry Juba, king of Mauritania, a scholar and friend of Augustus. Together they ruled from the shores of North Africa, a place where Rome met desert, where trade winds carried whispers from the Nile. In her palace at Caesarea, Cleopatra Selene built gardens filled with papyrus and lotuses, and statues of Isis beside Roman marble. A small Egypt, reborn in exile. There, the queen's daughter became the bridge between worlds, the first thread woven between Africa and Europe in the tapestry we now call history. Her children spoke Latin, her priests Egyptian, her merchants Greek. Beneath her reign, caravans moved salt, ivory, and stories. Empires may crumble, but cultures seldom die, they simply change masks. And so the rhythm of power shifted westward. The Roman legions, fed by Egypt's grain and paid by its gold, built roads across mountains and aqueducts across valleys. Cities rose, Londinium, Lutetia, Carthago Nova, each stamped with the same Roman pattern, like tesserae in a vast mosaic. The Mediterranean became not a sea that separated, but one that connected. Augustus grew old, then marble. His successors wore the purple and found it heavy. One after another, emperors rose and fell, their busts crowding the centuries like watchful ghosts. Some ruled well, others disastrously. Yet Rome endured, not through greatness alone, but through the inertia of habit. It had forgotten how not to rule. And still, in the eastern provinces, the old gods whispered. Alexandria remained restless, a city too clever for obedience. Philosophers debated under its colonnades, mathematicians charted stars, traders carried papyrus scrolls northward. 1,000 years after Cleopatra's death, her city still glittered like a stubborn jewel. But history, like the Nile, keeps flowing. Empires, like floods, eventually recede. The western half of Rome began to crack under the weight of its own stone. The grain shipments grew fewer. The legions thinned. Beyond the Alps, new peoples stirred, Goths, Vandals, Franks. They had watched Rome grow fat and began to wonder how the feast might taste. When at last they came, it was not with ceremony but with hunger. The eternal city burned, not once but many times. Statues fell. Libraries wept dust. Bishops prayed where senators once debated. And from those ashes, a strange new world began to take shape, half memory, half invention. In that world Cleopatra's name survived, like a dream that refuses to fade with dawn. The monks who copied manuscripts still whispered of her beauty and cunning. The scholars of Byzantium argued whether she was villain or visionary. The poets of the early Middle Ages, though they barely knew Egypt's shape, still invoked her as a symbol of both power and peril, a woman who ruled men's hearts and empires alike. And so the story drifted, from papyrus to parchment, from the mouth of the Nile to the monasteries of Europe. Each retelling smoothed its edges, gilded its morals, softened its danger. Cleopatra became less a queen and more a mirror, reflecting what each age feared or desired. In time, those stories would feed new legends, tales of knights and queens, of treachery and devotion, of crowns that cost more than they could give. For though the sand of Egypt still slept beneath the stars, its echo had already crossed the sea. The Roman Empire, bloated and fractured, would give birth to Byzantium in the east and to a dozen feuding kingdoms in the west. The Nile's lessons, of balance, of ambition, of beauty's peril, would flow quietly into the bloodstream of Europe. And as the centuries turned, new thrones rose and fell in the lands where Rome once ruled. In France, in England, in the misted forests of Germania, rulers would fight, wed, and betray with the same mixture of pride and longing that once filled the palaces of Alexandria. But that, dear listener, is a story for the next dream. For now, let us drift forward again, to the lands of stone keeps and candlelight, where old empires crumble into feudal dust. The torch passes from the marble of Rome to the timber of medieval castles. And though the language changes, the game remains the same. It is strange, isn't it, how quickly the present becomes the past? One generation believes itself to be the height of civilization, the next wanders through its ruins, wondering how such grandeur could fall. The last whispers of Cleopatra's age had long since turned to sand when the western half of Rome finally exhaled its last breath. The year was somewhere near the 5th century, though years meant little to those who lived through them. To a Roman senator watching the Goths ride through the city gates, it was not the end of an empire. It was simply Tuesday, and there was smoke in the sky. The marble halls of power that had once echoed with oratory now hosted the scratch of quills on parchment. In dim chambers, monks and scholars copied what they could of the old world, bits of Virgil, a line of Homer, fragments of Aristotle, all precious embers rescued from a drowned fire. Outside their cloisters, the roads that had bound the world together cracked and vanished beneath weeds. Rome became not a place, but a memory, a rumor of order, whispered about by people who had never seen a city larger than a village. The aqueducts stood like broken bones across hillsides. The amphitheaters filled with sheep instead of senators. And yet life went on. In the shadow of the ruins, new powers began to rise. Not emperors, but lords. Not legions, but knights. It was a different kind of order, smaller, more personal, stitched together with vows rather than decrees. Castles replaced forums, oaths replaced laws, and the sword became both tool and symbol. The church filled the silence Rome had left behind. Its cathedrals rose like stone prayers across Europe. The cross replaced the eagle, but both spoke of empire in their own ways, one of conquest, the other of faith. Still, in the flicker of candlelight within monasteries, monks sometimes traced the outlines of Cleopatra's Egypt in the margins of their manuscripts. They wrote of the Nile as a place of miracles, of pyramids that touched the sky, of a queen whose beauty undid nations. To them, she was less history than parable, a warning wrapped in perfume. If you could walk quietly through the corridors of one of those monasteries, you might hear the scratch of a quill and the soft rustle of parchment. You might see an old monk, head bent, writing. And so the empire of the pagans fell, that the kingdom of God might rise. Outside, the night would be thick with mist. The bells would toll the hour, slow, measured, as if counting the distance between one age and the next. Across the sea, the Eastern Empire, the Byzantines, still called themselves Romans. Their capital, Constantinople, glittered like a dream of what the West had lost. There, Greek and Latin mingled with Persian and Egyptian. In its libraries, scholars still debated philosophy older than the faith they now professed. The mosaics shimmered, the baths steamed, and the markets hummed with silk and spice. But even Byzantium could feel the tremor beneath its marble feet. Empires do not end in a single fall, but in a long sigh. Meanwhile, in the forests of Europe, people began to tell stories again. Strange, luminous tales of dragons and saints, of enchanted swords and sleeping kings. The world had grown smaller, darker, but in that darkness, imagination flared like firelight. And so began the long twilight of the Middle Ages. Where once Cleopatra's ships had sailed under sunlit banners, peasants now plowed fields beneath cold gray skies. The grandeur of Alexandria seemed impossible to them, like a dream told by a half-remembered ancestor. Yet the echoes remained. When a queen of the Franks wore gold upon her brow, they called her Cleopatra reborn. When a monk in Ireland gazed upon a jeweled Bible, he saw in its shining inks the lost glory of the East. And still, trade whispered between worlds. Arab merchants carried papyrus, spices, and stories along the same routes Cleopatra once ruled. They told of Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, new centers of knowledge where ancient wisdom had taken refuge. In their tales, the scholars of Islam preserved what Rome had forgotten: geometry, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and in doing so, they kept the candle of civilization alive. From Alexandria's ruins to the courts of Abbasid Baghdad, the thread continued, thin but unbroken. The ideas that Cleopatra's world had cherished still flowed, hidden beneath new languages, waiting to surface again in the West centuries later. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The low murmur of scribes in a candlelit room. The flutter of parchment pages. The distant clang of a blacksmith shaping a sword. And somewhere, faint and far away, the whisper of the Nile, still flowing, patient, eternal. For history is not a line, but a circle. What falls in marble may rise again in stone, or ink, or song. And so, as the last Roman memories dissolved into legend, a new age was stirring, an age of knights, kings, and long shadows. The Game of Thrones had not ended with Cleopatra. It had only changed its board. When Rome finally sank beneath its own reflection, Europe awoke as if from a long fever. The air was colder now, the light dimmer, and the languages rougher on the tongue. Yet beneath this darkness, seeds of something strange and resilient began to grow. The world was smaller, yes, but it pulsed with a stubborn kind of life, the kind that endures winters and still blooms in spring. Gone were the marble cities, replaced by fortresses of stone and wood. Gone were the emperors, replaced by kings who ruled more by charisma than decree. Gone was the certainty of empire, in its place, the uncertainty of faith. The old Roman roads still cut through forests and meadows, but travelers now whispered prayers as they walked them, wary of bandits and wolves. Where senators had once debated law, monks now debated sin. Where Cleopatra's scholars had charted the heavens, men now charted their souls. Still, the echo of the ancient world had not completely vanished. It lived on in the bones of buildings, in the Latin of the Church, in the habits of thought that refused to die. The torch passed quietly from one hand to another, from the scholars of Alexandria to the scribes of Ireland, from the artisans of Greece to the masons of France. The monasteries became islands of light in a darkened world. Their stone walls held more than prayers, they held memory. Within them, young novices learned to shape letters with reverence, each word an offering to both God and history. The act of writing became sacred, the ink itself a kind of devotion. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the scratch of quills, the murmured Latin, the soft creak of wooden benches. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet earth and smoke from nearby hearths. The world had slowed to the rhythm of candlelight. Across the fields, the villages grew in clusters around their churches. Life was governed by the seasons, sowing, reaping, fasting, feasting. Time was no longer measured by emperors but by bells. And yet, even here, echoes of Cleopatra's Egypt found subtle ways to breathe. The cross that crowned the churches bore, in its geometry, the same symmetry that had shaped the temples of Isis. The robes of bishops shimmered with patterns once woven for pharaohs. The gilded halos of saints gleamed like the sun disks of Ra. Civilization, it seems, never truly dies, it merely disguises itself. Meanwhile, far to the east, Byzantium still glittered like a jewel untouched by decay. Its domes caught the sun in gold mosaics, its scholars preserved the words of Plato and Herodotus. From its ports, trade carried silk and silver into the west, and with them, ideas. Through merchants, monks, and pilgrims, the faint perfume of the ancient world drifted back into Europe. It whispered through the monasteries and royal courts like a half-remembered melody. The nobles of France began to build palaces inspired by Roman proportion. Scholars in Italy began to read again, hungrily, of geometry and medicine. Even the stories of Cleopatra herself, though half-myth now, returned, dressed in the language of chivalry. In these retellings, she was no longer the queen of the Nile but a kind of medieval enchantress, the serpent of the south, both beautiful and dangerous, the feminine face of ambition. the chroniclers warned their readers. As with Cleopatra, so with all who would rule love before they rule themselves. The medieval world had a taste for moral lessons hidden in legend. But what it did not know was that, beneath those parables, it was already carrying the old world's wisdom forward, buried in its architecture, its mathematics, even its dreams. In castles of rough stone, the torch of civilization flickered faintly, but it never went out. Lords and ladies gathered in great halls hung with tapestries depicting saints, crusaders, and sometimes, strange scenes of pyramids and desert suns. None could quite explain why. At night, troubadours sang of love that defied reason, of beauty that outlasted death. Their melodies wove together faith and longing, just as the Nile once wove life and eternity. And beneath it all, the same old rhythm beat quietly. Power sought beauty, beauty sought wisdom, and wisdom, always, slipped just out of reach. It was a simpler world, and yet it carried the weight of all that had come before. As the centuries rolled onward, Europe began to knit itself together again, through faith, trade, and sometimes blood. The kingdoms that had been mere names in the chaos after Rome now grew teeth and flags. Francia, Britannia, Hispania, each a new chapter in the long, unbroken story of ambition. But the game, oh yes, the game remained the same. Kings rose, queens ruled behind curtains, alliances shifted like sand. The pieces changed, the board endured. And in every court, from London to Constantinople, there was always one question whispered behind silken veils and candle flames. Who truly holds power, the ruler, or the one who rules the ruler's heart? That question had haunted Antony and Cleopatra. It would haunt the Plantagenets, the Capetians, the Tudors, and beyond. For history, like love, never ends cleanly. It echoes softly, like footsteps in a hall. And so, as the medieval dawn spread across Europe, smoky, fragrant with wood fires and rain, the world prepared for its next great act. From the sands of Egypt to the castles of England, the pattern would repeat: desire, betrayal, crown, fall. The names would change, but the story would remain ancient, eternal. By the time the 10th century dawned, Europe had grown used to uncertainty. Empires had fallen, faiths had risen, and the sky itself seemed closer somehow, darker, yet filled with quiet promise. The people of these lands no longer measured greatness by marble or empire, but by endurance. To survive was to rule was to survive a little longer than the next man. Kings were no longer distant figures of divine majesty. They were flesh and bone, mortal, flawed, and very often afraid. They sat in draughty halls, warmed by flickering fires and uneasy loyalty. Their thrones were not of gold but of oak, carved by the same hands that might one day tear them down. And yet each king, from the coasts of Normandy to the forests of Saxony, dreamed the same dream, that his line might outlast the wind. They built castles to prove it. Heavy, square, and stubborn against the weather, these fortresses were as much symbols as shelters. Their stones said, "I was here. Remember me." Within their walls, banners fluttered, coins were minted, and alliances forged over goblets of wine that tasted faintly of iron. The court was a theater, and every actor knew their lines: the noble, the knight, the priest, the jester, the queen. Ah, the queens! They smiled from behind veils and tapestries, their eyes as sharp as daggers. They understood the true game better than most. Power, after all, was rarely won by the sword alone. Sometimes it was coaxed, charmed, or quietly rearranged in candlelight. In them, the ghost of Cleopatra stirred again, that mixture of grace and calculation, of silk hiding steel. Each queen knew that beauty faded but intelligence, well placed, could last generations. And for every crown that glittered there was a price. Some kings, like England's Henry II, found that love and rule made uneasy bedfellows. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, fierce, brilliant, untamable, was the very image of a medieval Cleopatra. She rode to crusade, governed in his absence, and turned her court into a temple of poetry and wit. Yet she also turned her sons against him. History, it seems, has a fondness for irony. Elsewhere, in the cold north, kings ruled by fear and fire. In the south, they ruled by faith. But everywhere, the same pattern unfolded: ambition begot betrayal, and betrayal begot legend. The chroniclers, those quiet keepers of the past, wrote of battles and coronations, but they knew the truer wars were fought in silence. In whispered confessions, in secret letters sealed with wax and tears, in glances across banquet tables where the wrong smile could be fatal. The world was now a web, intricate, delicate, and always trembling with unseen motion. Yet amid this intrigue, beauty persisted. The same instinct that had built Cleopatra's Alexandria now carved cathedrals out of stone. Their spires reached toward heaven, their stained glass caught sunlight like jewels. Each arch, each carving, was a kind of defiance, a reminder that even in darkness, humanity remembered how to create. At the heart of these kingdoms, the Church watched all with patient eyes. It crowned kings and absolved sins, but it also whispered warnings. "Remember," it said, "the world is not yours, but God's." And still, kings built. They built to be remembered, as all rulers do. In their dreams, they saw themselves not as men but as heirs to the great empires of old, to Caesar, to Alexander, even to Cleopatra. Some wore rings engraved with sphinxes or carried relics said to come from Egypt, as though owning a fragment of the past could lend their reigns legitimacy. And in a way it did. For power, even imagined, is still power. In the evenings, when torches flickered against the castle walls, troubadours sang of ancient love and ruin, of queens who defied empires, of warriors undone by beauty. Their songs mixed truth with myth until no one could tell where history ended and legend began. But perhaps that was the point. For what is a king, if not a story his people tell themselves about order? And what is a queen, if not the memory of grace preserved in a world of iron? In this delicate balance, between the sword and the heart, medieval Europe found its rhythm. Feasts followed famines. Wars gave way to truces. And through it all, the wheel of history turned, slow and patient, grinding marble and bone alike into dust that would one day nourish new dreams. Beyond the battlements, the peasants tilled the soil, the monks prayed, and the minstrels wandered. The world was not peaceful, but it was alive. And far across the sea, in the stillness of Egypt's sands, the old stones watched with knowing silence. Empires had fallen before. They would fall again. The desert was in no hurry. For every crown forged, another waited to be melted. For every throne built, another lay buried beneath time. And so the medieval world, in all its pageantry and peril, continued the same eternal story, one of power's beauty and its price. Power, when it is spoken of in chronicles, is almost always loud. It rides to war, it signs decrees, it wears armor that glitters beneath banners. But in truth, the deepest power is soft-spoken, the kind that moves unseen, the kind that shapes kings while they sleep. In medieval Europe, that power often wore silk and perfume. It spoke in counsel rather than command. It smiled where men scowled. And it understood, better than any sword or army, that empires are built as much upon affection as upon fear. The great queens of the Middle Ages knew this intimately. They had watched what happened when men mistook conquest for control. They knew, as Cleopatra once knew, that the art of rule lies not in domination but in persuasion, the quiet mastery of hearts. Eleanor of Aquitaine, that storm of wit and will, was not alone in her subtle empire. Across France, England, Spain, and Byzantium, women sat beside thrones and whispered the words that shaped destinies. There was Empress Theodora in Constantinople, a woman born of the theater who rose to share the throne of Justinian. She advised him with unflinching clarity, and when rebellion threatened the empire, it was she, not he, who steadied the crown. Her words, calm and sharp as a dagger, are said to have saved the city. Those who have worn the crown should never live to see it thrown aside. And so she stayed. And so did the empire. Centuries later, in France, Blanche of Castile ruled as regent while her son, the future St. Louis, grew to manhood. She negotiated, commanded armies, and signed treaties, all while dressed in the plain veil of a widow. Her courtiers whispered that she was stern. But the chroniclers, always half in awe, wrote simply, "She ruled." In England, queens like Matilda and later Eleanor would wield similar authority. Even when denied the throne outright, they bent history's trajectory by sheer persistence. When men said, "A woman cannot rule," they simply smiled and did it anyway, by correspondence, by proxy, by quiet arrangement. And yet, their power was never safe. A queen's influence was always a delicate balance, poised between admiration and suspicion. Too quiet, and she was dismissed. Too bold, and she was condemned. It was a dance, graceful, perilous, eternal. In the great halls of Europe, where torchlight trembled upon polished shields, the air was thick with rumor. A queen's smile could start a war. Her silence could end one. Men toasted her beauty at feasts, even as they plotted to strip her of authority the next morning. Still, they could not quite manage it. The crown may have rested on the king's head, but the kingdom often moved at the queen's command. At night, when the lords had gone and the torches burned low, the queen's chambers became the true seat of governance. Messengers slipped through side doors with sealed letters. Advisers murmured over maps and treaties. Somewhere nearby, a harp played softly, a pretense of leisure to mask the machinery of strategy. It was here, in these shadowed rooms, that alliances were born, not in the noise of war, but in the quiet of thought. And if you listen closely, through the centuries, you can almost hear Cleopatra laughing softly. For she, too, had once ruled from behind a curtain of silk, speaking with poets and generals alike, turning the course of empires with a gesture. In many ways, her legacy had simply changed its wardrobe. Even as the medieval world claimed to worship purity and piety, its rulers learned, again and again, that charisma and cunning were a queen's sharpest weapons. Some used them for peace. Some for vengeance. All used them for survival. The people loved to believe their queens were either angels or serpents, nothing in between. The truth, of course, was both. A queen had to be both. From Isabella of Castile to Margaret of Anjou, from the Byzantine empresses to the queens of Crusader Jerusalem, the pattern held: the stronger the woman, the louder the world whispered against her. Yet the kingdom stood because of them. Even the church, though wary, found itself quietly indebted to these women. Queens built monasteries, patronized cathedrals, endowed hospitals, and, on more than one occasion, persuaded their husbands not to plunge Europe into ruin over wounded pride. In them, the wisdom of the ancients lived on. They ruled not by decree, but by the art of timing, of patience, of understanding how power breathes. When a king marched to war, it was the queen who decided whether the treasury would open. When a treaty arrived, it was her hand that weighed its worth. When the heirs quarreled, it was she who decided which son would live to inherit. To history, their influence looks like a shadow. But shadows, as every artist knows, reveal the light's direction. And so, as Europe entered its high medieval bloom, the age of cathedrals, crusades, and courtly love, it did so with queens as its quiet architects. They did not build with stone or sword, but with memory, promise, and persuasion. And they left marks that time itself has not erased. For behind every crown lies another, unseen, unrecorded yet eternal. There are centuries that whisper and centuries that burn. The high Middle Ages were both. Faith filled the air like incense, heavy, beautiful, and at times suffocating. Every bell that tolled was a reminder that the world belonged to God, and yet, in the corners of that same world, men and women dreamed their own forbidden dreams. By the 12th century, Europe had become a vast cathedral. Every town and village was a note in the same hymn. The cross-crowned hilltops, rivers bore the names of saints, and the calendar itself was carved from holy days. To live was to believe. But belief, as history knows too well, can warm or it can burn. The same hands that built the cathedrals also lit the pyres. The same lips that prayed for mercy shouted for punishment. For faith, when absolute, leaves little room for doubt, and doubt is the breath of wisdom. Still, there was beauty in that age. The churches rose like mountains of stone, vast and delicate. Their stained glass windows caught sunlight and broke it into 1,000 jeweled pieces that danced across the floors like blessings. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wax and thyme. Candles flickered like the souls of the faithful. The choir's chant rolled like tidewater through the nave. And somewhere in that mingling of sound and shadow, humanity felt, if only for a moment, that it had touched the eternal. The monks who tended these sanctuaries lived lives of silence. They rose before dawn, prayed through the gray light of morning, copied manuscripts until their eyes blurred, and then prayed again. To them, the world outside was noise, the world within, an echo of paradise. They kept knowledge alive, mathematics from the Greeks, medicine from the Arabs, astronomy from forgotten scrolls. They wrote on vellum the words that had once been inked on papyrus in Cleopatra's library. In this way, Egypt's lost wisdom still breathed, cloaked now in Latin prayers. But the fire of faith had another face. Beyond the monastery walls, armies marched eastward beneath the sign of the cross. The Crusades, half pilgrimage, half conquest, carried Europe's restless hunger across the sea. They sought to reclaim Jerusalem, to wash the Holy Land in devotion. Yet what began as prayer often ended as plunder. The knights who rode into battle sang hymns and drew blood with the same hands. They believed themselves chosen, righteous, and that belief made them unstoppable and dangerous. And still, in their tents at night, many wept. For the heart of faith is not certainty, but longing. In the villages they left behind, faith was a simpler thing. The peasants prayed to saints for rain, to Mary for mercy, to relics for miracles. The line between the sacred and the superstitious blurred like fog over a field. Holy wells, once dedicated to ancient gods, now bore crosses. Festivals of fertility became feasts of saints. The past, as always, wore a new name and continued on. And in that mingling of pagan memory and Christian order, something deeply human persisted, the need to find meaning, to make beauty, to believe in something larger than one's hunger. Not all belief was welcome, of course. Those who saw differently, who heard whispers of divinity outside the church's walls, were called heretics. The Cathars of southern France spoke of a God beyond matter. The mystics of Germany saw visions of divine light that frightened their confessors. And then there were the women, the visionaries, the healers, the midwives, who spoke softly of dreams and herbs and unseen powers. Some were revered as saints. Others were burned as witches. Faith, in this age, was both comfort and weapon. It bound kingdoms together under a shared sky, but it also built invisible prisons for the mind. The same light that guided pilgrims could blind the thinker. The same fire that warmed cathedrals devoured the curious. And yet, despite its contradictions, this was an age of wonder. Imagine walking through a medieval town at dusk. The sky deepens to indigo, smoke drifts from chimneys, a bell tolls in the distance. The cobblestones are wet from rain, gleaming like obsidian. A procession moves past, monks in hooded robes, carrying candles that tremble in the wind. Behind them, villagers kneel, murmuring prayers that blend with the rustle of leaves. There is peace in it, fragile, imperfect, but real. At the tavern, a traveler tells of distant lands, Constantinople's golden domes, Cairo's perfumed markets, the sands where Cleopatra's tomb is said to lie hidden beneath the ruins of a temple. The villagers listen, wide-eyed, as though hearing a ghost. For them, Egypt is not a place but a spell, the ancient world's reflection shimmering just beyond their reach. They cannot know it, but the same stars that shone upon Cleopatra now glimmer above their thatched roofs. The same moon watches their prayers. History's thread remains unbroken, invisible but strong. The scholars in the universities, new, fragile institutions, begin to question quietly. Can faith and reason both be true? They ask. The Church answers, yes, but in the proper order. The argument never really ends. Still, within those debates, the seeds of the Renaissance sleep, waiting for warmth. For every pyre lit by zeal, a candle of knowledge flickers in defiance. For every heretic silenced, another question is whispered into the night. The Middle Ages, despite their fear and fire, are not dark. They are luminous in a different way, like the glow of embers after flame. And so, as we drift deeper into this age of prayers and paradox, the world prepares for another quiet revolution. The kind that begins, not with swords or crowns, but with thought. The world does not leap forward, it stirs, stretches, yawns, and then opens its eyes. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe awoke softly, like a scholar rising after a long winter. The darkness had not been complete, no age truly is, but now there was light enough to read by. It began, as many great awakenings do, with questions. In abbeys and monasteries, monks who had long copied texts began to understand them. The act of transcription, once a ritual of devotion, became an act of thought. Margins filled with notes, queries, and quiet contradictions. And soon these monks found themselves not merely preserving knowledge, but creating it. The old Greek and Roman texts, once forgotten, returned like long-lost relatives. Aristotle's logic, Plato's ideals, Galen's anatomy, these ideas arrived from Arabic scholars who had safeguarded them during Europe's sleep. From Baghdad to Cordoba to Sicily, knowledge traveled westward again, borne by translators, traders, and dreamers. The manuscripts were fragile, the ink fading, but their ideas were indestructible. In Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, new gatherings formed, Studia Generalia, the first universities. They were humble places at first, a borrowed hall, a few benches, a pile of parchment. But the minds within were alive. Students argued in Latin beneath candlelight, debating whether reason could explain creation, whether man could know God through intellect as well as faith. The Church, cautious but curious, tolerated this at first. After all, knowledge, when tamed, could serve belief. But the line between understanding and heresy proved as thin as the parchment they wrote upon. Still, the scholars pressed on. The act of writing itself changed. The Gothic script, all sharp angles and grace, replaced the rounded letters of old. Illuminated manuscripts gleamed like constellations, gold-leaf stars scattered across fields of indigo and crimson. Each letter seemed alive, curling like a vine around the edges of thought. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of that time, the soft scratch of quills, the murmur of Latin phrases, the occasional sneeze from ink dust, the flutter of pages. It was a quieter revolution, but no less grand. And while monks debated in candlelight, outside their cloisters the world grew busier. Towns expanded. Merchants traveled farther. The hum of trade joined the hum of learning. In bustling markets, spices from Alexandria mingled with wool from Flanders. Coins clinked, languages mixed, and curiosity followed commerce like a shadow. kings began to see the power of knowledge too. For every crown forged in war, another was strengthened by intellect. They hired scholars to draft laws, map borders, and advise on matters of faith. The great rulers of Europe realized that parchment could achieve what armies could not: order, legitimacy, legacy. And somewhere in that exchange, between the scholar's ink and the king's seal, the modern world began to breathe. It is strange, perhaps, to think that Cleopatra would have understood this moment. Her Egypt had been a realm of libraries and astronomers, of scholars who spoke in starlight and geometry. The monks of the 13th century, bent over their desks, were her distant heirs. They shared her devotion to knowledge, even if they would not have recognized her gods. In dim scriptoria, they traced the movement of the heavens, charting eclipses with trembling precision. They studied the human body, the seasons, the stars. Some wrote of love disguised as theology, others of God disguised as philosophy. And from their efforts, a quiet revolution of perception began. They realized that the world was not flat but round, that motion followed pattern, that thought itself could be mapped like constellations. Each discovery was small, a flicker in the vast dark, but together they formed a dawn. And oh, how fragile it was! For every thinker celebrated, another was silenced. The church still watched with wary eyes. Curiosity, like fire, was useful but dangerous. A flame to warm the faithful, or to burn them. Yet it could not be contained. Ideas, once born, have wings. From parchment to parchment, from tongue to tongue, the questions spread. What is the nature of truth? What is the place of man? And with every answer, new questions followed. In time, this restlessness would lead to inventions unimaginable: machines, voyages, philosophies, revolutions. But in this moment, here, amid candle smoke and quills, it was still a whisper. Picture a scholar, perhaps in Paris, seated by a window in the late evening. His breath fogs the glass. He dips his pen and writes slowly, carefully, the way a monk might pray. Outside, the bells toll the hour. The city sleeps, but his mind travels, backward to Aristotle, forward to infinity. He is part of a chain that stretches back to Alexandria, to the papyrus scrolls that once burned by the Nile. History, it seems, does not vanish. It transforms. And as the 13th century turns to the 14th, knowledge seeps into new hands: artists, inventors, poets, dreamers. Soon, ink will paint not only words but the soul itself. The world is about to rediscover beauty. It begins, as so many awakenings do, with a face. For centuries, painters had filled Europe's churches with saints and angels, flat, still, gazing forever forward, their halos glowing like small suns. But something began to stir behind those golden eyes. The artists started to wonder, what if holiness had a shadow? What if divinity had expression? And so, in quiet workshops smelling of pigment and oil, the painted world began to breathe. Italy, still humming with the memory of Rome, became the canvas of this change. In Florence, Siena, and Venice, artists started to look at people, truly look at them, not as symbols but as beings of flesh and feeling. Faces softened. Hands curved. Bodies gained weight and warmth. The divine became human, and the human divine. Giotto di Bondone, that shepherd boy who once watched the sky from Tuscan hills, dipped his brush and did what no one had dared in centuries. He painted emotion. His Virgin Mary did not stare coldly into eternity, she wept. His saints turned their heads, clasped their hands, touched one another in grief and grace. In Giotto's frescoes, the medieval world tilted toward the light. When his contemporaries first saw his work, they were bewildered. "He paints as though the figures could move," one exclaimed. And indeed they could, at least, in the imagination. Soon others followed. Cimabue, Duccio, and the painters of Siena turned sacred scenes into living stories. The Madonna smiled faintly. The Christ child reached for his mother's veil. Even the angels looked at one another, as though surprised to find themselves painted at all. Something extraordinary was happening, the rediscovery of the real. And yet, it was not rebellion. These artists were still devout. Their faith was not fading, it was evolving. They sought God not only in heaven but in the curve of a cheek, the play of light on stone, the shadow beneath a hand. It was as though the world itself, the tangible, imperfect world, had become holy again. Outside the workshops, Florence's streets echoed with hammers and laughter. Merchants shouted beneath striped awnings. The Arno River caught the sun like liquid bronze. And in the midst of all this clamor, art became the city's second language. Painters were no longer anonymous servants of faith. They were thinkers, storytellers, philosophers in pigment. Their patrons were bankers, popes, and princes. Gold was traded for immortality, not the kind promised by priests, but the kind offered by portraiture. Soon, the wealthy wanted to see themselves on the walls, not as saints, but as they truly were. Lines, flaws, pride, longing, all preserved in oil and tempera. It was a quiet revolution. Cleopatra would have smiled to see it. She, who once bathed in perfumes and adorned herself in gold, knew that power and beauty were both performances, mirrors of the soul's ambition. The artists of this new age rediscovered that truth with brushes instead of crowns. In their work, the human face became the stage upon which history played out. The air in their studios was thick with dust and turpentine. Apprentices ground pigments, lapis lazuli from the east for heavenly blues, crushed cinnabar for royal reds. They mixed them with egg yolk, wine, or oil, creating colors that gleamed like stained glass on plaster walls. Outside, the world remained rough. Plague swept through towns. Wars flared between kingdoms. But within the walls of a painter's studio, something gentler was taking shape, a belief that beauty itself could heal. Even kings began to sense it. They hung paintings in their halls not just for devotion but for reflection. The subjects looked back at them, as if to ask, "Are you certain you rule yourself, before you rule others?" Art had become a mirror, and the world was startled by its own reflection. At night, when the city slept, those same painters often returned to their work by candlelight. The flame flickered across their canvases, making faces seem to move, as though whispering across centuries. The line between life and art blurred. And then, quietly, the idea of perspective was born. A single, revolutionary thought that the world could be measured through the eye, that depth, distance, and reality could be drawn, not merely imagined. Lines converged, and the flat world gained space. It was not only geometry. It was revelation. Perspective taught man his place in the universe, not at the center, but within it. The viewer was no longer above creation but inside it. In this discovery, the spirit of the Renaissance took its first breath. And so, while monks still copied scripture and kings still quarreled, another kind of faith spread, faith in the mind, in the hand, in the human capacity to see. The painters did not know it, but they had cracked open a door that would never close again. Through that doorway, light poured, golden, endless, unstoppable. Dawn is not always gentle. Sometimes it arrives with too much light, too much clarity. The world blinks, dazzled, and sees itself anew. So it was with the Renaissance. The medieval night had not been dark, only dim, candlelit and dreaming. But now, as the 15th century unfolded, a brilliant restlessness flooded Europe. Painters, poets, architects, scientists, all stirred by the same fever, curiosity. It began in Italy, though not by design. Florence, that huddled republic of bankers and builders, was a hive of energy. Wealth poured from its counting houses into marble, music, and learning. The Medici family, patrons, schemers, art's unlikely midwives, gathered talent like kings collected armies. They paid painters to decorate chapels, poets to praise them, and philosophers to remind the world that wisdom had once lived in Greece. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be ancient and new at once. Streets filled with statues modeled after long-broken Roman originals. The very stones of Florence seemed to remember their lineage. Builders spoke not of fortresses but of proportion. Architects whispered the names of Vitruvius and Euclid like spells. And amid all this wonder, this confident revival of old genius, came chaos. Because curiosity, once freed, has no master. Princes who funded painters soon found themselves envying them. Merchants who sold pigments now discussed Plato. Monks wrote treatises on astronomy. Women, long excluded from learning, began to read and write in secret, their minds as bright as the mirrors they were forbidden to own. The world was being remade, not by kings, but by questions. And no one embodied this new age of questions more than the artists themselves. There was a man from Vinci, quiet, observant, endlessly patient, who sketched flying machines in the margins of his notebooks and studied the curl of water as though it held the secret of existence. Leonardo. His hands moved between art and science without distinction. To him, both were languages of the same divine curiosity. And there was another, Michelangelo, who sculpted as though freeing souls trapped in stone. He said the figure already existed within the marble. His task was only to release it. One can imagine Cleopatra, listening across centuries, nodding in approval. She too had understood that power often lies hidden, waiting for the right hand to reveal it. Around them, Europe buzzed with invention. Printing presses thundered in German workshops, pouring words into the world faster than thought could contain them. No longer could knowledge be confined to monasteries or monarchs. It was loose, flying on the wings of cheap paper. Books traveled like pilgrims, bearing ideas instead of relics. And so, new worlds opened. Maps were redrawn. Compasses pointed men toward horizons they had never dared imagine. Ships left the harbors of Portugal and Spain, carrying with them faith, greed, and wonder in equal measure. For some, it was a miracle, for others, a nightmare. The known world expanded, but so did its shadows. The same hunger that painted the Sistine ceiling also tore open continents. The Renaissance, for all its brilliance, was not peace. It was movement, turbulent, radiant, human. The old order trembled. The Church, once the axis of all, now faced thinkers who asked whether God required intermediaries at all. Astronomers whispered that the earth might move around the sun, not the other way around. Philosophers spoke of individual worth, of human dignity, of reason unchained. To question was to live, and to risk everything. Yet amid this storm of intellect, there was laughter too. Feasts grew wilder. Plays filled the squares. Music changed. The chants of the monasteries gave way to harmonies that wove joy and sorrow together. It was as though the human heart itself had discovered a new scale. Imagine walking through Florence in those years, the sound of chisels, the scent of wet plaster, the chatter of merchants and scholars. Somewhere, a painter argues about anatomy. Somewhere else, a poet recites verses about Venus and virtue in the same breath. The air hums with creation. And yet, as the light grows brighter, the shadows sharpen too. Kings feel the tremor of change beneath their thrones. The old certainties falter. There is talk of reform, of scripture in the people's tongue, of knowledge belonging to all. The Church listens, and begins to prepare its defenses. For the age of curiosity is also the age of heresy. But not yet. Not tonight. For now, let us rest in this dawn, where the marble gleams wet and new, and the world, so newly self-aware, marvels at its own reflection. It will not last, of course. Nothing perfect ever does. But for a moment, humankind believes again that it can touch the divine through thought, through art, through love. And that belief, tender, trembling, is worth all the chaos that follows. It began, as so many revolutions do, not with an army but with ink. In the early 16th century, the printing press, that humble machine of wooden blocks and iron screws, became the most dangerous weapon in Europe. For with every page it pressed, it multiplied thought, and thought cannot be contained. The spark came from a monk named Martin Luther. He was not the first to question the Church's power, but he was the first to do so at a moment when the world could hear him. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg, a quiet act, perhaps intended for scholarly debate. But the sound of those nails echoed like thunder through Christendom. Within weeks, his words were printed, copied, smuggled, and read aloud in taverns and marketplaces. The faithful listened, wide-eyed. For the first time, they were told that their souls might not need priests, indulgences, or Rome, that they could speak to God directly. It was liberation. It was heresy. It was both. The Church, accustomed to centuries of unquestioned authority, reeled. But the age of obedience had already cracked. The Renaissance had taught men to trust their eyes, their minds, their own measure of truth. Now the Reformation told them to trust their hearts. Certainty, that comforting, unyielding stone of the medieval world, began to crumble. And as it did, Europe trembled. Princes saw opportunity in chaos. Some sided with Rome, others with reform. Armies took up banners not only of nations but of creeds. The wars that followed would last generations, drenching faith itself in blood. Yet beneath the violence, something profound unfolded, the birth of the modern conscience. For centuries, the Church had been the architect of knowledge, the keeper of morality, the bridge between heaven and earth. Now people began to ask, can the soul stand alone? Can truth be private? It was terrifying, and it was freeing. In candlelit rooms, printers worked by night, setting type for illegal pamphlets. They smuggled Bibles in vernacular tongues, German, English, French, words once forbidden now placed in common hands. Imagine the feeling of a peasant woman reading scripture aloud in her own language for the first time, her voice trembling with both awe and fear. The words, once distant as stars, now belonged to her. And yet, freedom is never tidy. Where one truth shattered, 100 others sprang up. Reformers quarreled among themselves. New sects rose and fell like waves. Faith became a battlefield not only between nations, but within souls. Still, amid the noise, the idea of the individual emerged more clearly than ever before. The human being, small, flawed, questioning, now stood face to face with God, without intermediaries. The ripple of that idea spread beyond religion. It touched politics, art, and science. It whispered, "You may think for yourself." And thought, once unleashed, cannot return to silence. But for all its brilliance, the Reformation was also heartbreak. Families divided, towns burned, libraries vanished. Europe's once united dream of Christendom fractured into nations, each claiming to hold the purest light. In Rome, artists still painted angels across ceilings, their wings luminous with gold. But beyond the city's walls, the sky darkened with smoke. This was the paradox of progress. Every revelation casts a new shadow. And yet, even in turmoil, there was beauty. Music changed, the solemn chants of old giving way to hymns sung by entire congregations. The people's voices rose together, imperfect but alive. The sacred had left the cathedral and entered the heart. It was no longer about what one believed but how one believed. And in that shift, Europe took another step toward modernity, toward reason, individuality, and doubt. But oh, the cost! The wars of religion would scar the continent. The Inquisition would rise to defend orthodoxy. Fear and fire would walk side by side with faith. Still, something irreversible had begun. The age of divine order was ending. The age of human responsibility was dawning. Imagine standing in a city like Nuremberg or London in those years. The bells still ring for Mass, but now they compete with the cry of printers and the murmur of debate. The air hums with conviction and unease. For centuries, people had been told that truth was a single flame. Now they saw it flicker into 1,000 smaller lights, each casting its own glow. Confusion, perhaps, but also wonder. The world, for all its blood and blasphemy, had become more human. And so, as this age of certainty breaks apart, another begins to form, one of science, exploration, and unquenchable curiosity. The questions that faith could not answer will soon be asked of nature itself. The telescope will replace the relic. The experiment will replace the sermon. The universe, once sacred mystery, will become a puzzle to solve. And yet, beneath all that inquiry, the same longing endures, to understand, to belong, to glimpse the infinite. For even as men look to the stars, they are still, always, searching for God. The sea, dear listener, is the oldest lullaby in the world. Long before empires or kings, it whispered against the shore, promising both adventure and oblivion. By the 16th century, that whisper had become a roar. Europe, restless, curious, and hungry, turned its gaze outward. The Renaissance had taught men to look inward, to measure and paint and question. But now they wanted to go. The maps of the age were half-finished dreams, vast oceans labeled here be dragons, coastlines drawn with the trembling ink of imagination. Yet still, they set sail. The compass pointed the way, the stars gave their blessing. Ships like floating cathedrals, galleons of oak and canvas, creaked and groaned as they slipped into the unknown. And with them went the hopes and sins of a continent. Merchants dreamed of spices and gold. Monarchs dreamed of dominion. Priests dreamed of souls to save. And sailors, they dreamed simply of surviving the next storm. Imagine the sound of a ship at dawn, ropes tightening, gulls crying, the slap of waves against wood. The air thick with salt tar, and the faint scent of fear. For to cross an ocean then was to bargain with death. Storms rose like living things. Weeks could pass without sight of land, and food, hardtack, salted meat, stale beer, turned the stomach before it filled it. Scurvy lurked in every pale face. Yet still, they went on. Because beyond that endless horizon, rumor said, lay wonder. In 1492, Columbus set sail westward, and changed the world, though perhaps not as he intended. He found not Asia but another world altogether, vast and old and inhabited. His discovery, wrapped in pride and misunderstanding, opened an age both glorious and grim. Explorers followed like waves. Vasco da Gama rounded Africa. Magellan circled the globe, though he did not live to see the journey's end. Each voyage brought knowledge, new lands, new maps, new stars charted, but also conquest, slavery, and greed. The old world had found the new, and the meeting was rarely kind. Yet for all the sorrow, there was wonder too. Plants never seen in Europe, tomatoes, maize, tobacco, cacao, crossed the seas and transformed life itself. The very taste of the world changed. Coffee houses would soon hum with debate. Sugar would sweeten both tea and tragedy. Gold and silver from the Americas would flood the treasuries of kings, and the imaginations of poets. The sea gave, and the sea took away. There were moments of breathtaking beauty, the first sight of a tropical sunrise after weeks of gray ocean, or the eerie calm before a storm when the wind seemed to hold its breath. And there were moments of horror, shipwrecks on coral reefs, mutinies born of starvation, native civilizations undone by disease carried in silence across the waves. History in this age wore a double face, explorer and conqueror, dreamer and thief. Yet beneath it all was that same restless yearning to know what lay beyond. In Lisbon and Seville, sailors gathered in taverns to tell tales that blurred fact and fantasy. They spoke of islands of gold, of sea monsters, of kingdoms richer than imagination. Some swore they'd glimpsed the edge of paradise. Others never returned to tell their tales. Still, the ships kept leaving. Because something in the human soul cannot stand still. The world grew smaller with every voyage, and larger, too, for now there was more to wonder at, more to desire, more to fear. In this restless expansion, Europe began to weave its web across the globe. Ports sprouted like seeds in strange soil. Languages mingled. Goods, ideas, and diseases crossed oceans as easily as birds. It was, in a strange way, the beginning of our world, the first pulse of globalization, the first tremor of the modern age. But beneath the triumphal stories of discovery lay the quiet tragedy of the discovered. The native peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia found their worlds rewritten, often erased, by those who claimed to bring civilization. One can almost hear the sea murmuring even now, not only the song of exploration, but the low lament of what was lost. Still, history sails on. For every conqueror there was also a scholar, a cartographer, a dreamer mapping the heavens. The age of discovery was not only about new lands, but new ways of seeing, the world as a globe, time as a journey, knowledge as something ever expanding. By the end of the 16th century, the old medieval cosmos, flat, fixed, certain, had dissolved into vastness. The earth was round, the stars infinite, and humankind suddenly small again. But smallness, oddly enough, was freeing. To stand on a shore and watch a ship vanish into the horizon was to feel both fear and faith, that the world, for all its dangers, was worth knowing. And so, as we drift with these explorers, rocked gently by the waves, we too feel that lull between awe and unease. The sea hums beneath us like a heartbeat. The world is changing, not loudly, but deeply. When next we wake, that hum will have turned to the rhythm of wheels and pistons, for soon the earth itself will be conquered not by sails but by steam. But for now, let us stay with the sea, endless, ancient, and softly singing. The waves recede. The sails fall silent. The ship's lantern becomes a candle on a desk. Ink replaces compass, curiosity remains the wind. Europe, having conquered seas and kingdoms, now turns to the final frontier, the human mind. The 17th and 18th centuries were an age of thinkers, philosophers and scientists, scribblers and dreamers who believed, perhaps for the first time, that reason itself could illuminate the world. They called it the Enlightenment, as though knowledge were sunlight, and superstition merely the fog of morning. But light, as we know, can both reveal and blind. In the salons of Paris and the coffee houses of London, conversation sparkled like crystal. The air shimmered with ideas. People debated not just politics, but morality, nature, and even the soul. What is liberty? Someone might ask over a cup of steaming chocolate. What is happiness? Is the universe a clock, and are we its gears? The questions came endlessly, each one chasing the next like fireflies. Science, too, blossomed. Galileo's telescope had already shown that heaven was not perfect, that the moon bore scars and shadows. Newton, with quiet patience, wrote the mathematics of the cosmos. The apple fell, and with it, an entire worldview, one that saw not divine whim but divine order in motion. Imagine, dear listener, the wonder of that revelation, that the same force pulling an apple to Earth also keeps the planets dancing in their orbits. The world, once governed by miracles, now turned on invisible law. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Because if the universe ran by rules, where then was God? The thinkers of the Enlightenment wrestled with this question endlessly. Some found God in the laws themselves, a divine clockmaker who built the machine and then stepped back. Others began to wonder if the machine needed no maker at all. Doubt crept in, elegant and polite, wearing a powdered wig. And yet, for all its rationality, this was not a cold age. There was poetry in precision, passion in clarity. To the Enlightenment mind, truth was not a doctrine but a journey, a slow, luminous unfolding. The printing press once again played its part. Books multiplied like stars, spreading philosophy to every corner of Europe. Even the poor, if they could read, might stumble upon Voltaire or Rousseau in a second-hand stall. Voltaire, sharp-tongued, amused, forever poking at hypocrisy. Rousseau, wild-hearted, insisting that reason alone could not nourish the human soul. Between them, the Enlightenment found both wit and sorrow. For as reason brightened the world, it also revealed its shadows. Factories rose where fields had been. Cities swelled with smoke and noise. The promise of progress came with the hum of machines, the beginning of an age both wondrous and weary. People no longer feared demons in the dark, but poverty, disease, and loneliness. And loneliness, that quiet ghost of modernity, began to walk beside progress. For when reason dethrones mystery, something sacred is lost. The medieval peasant had lived in a cosmos alive with meaning, angels, saints, and signs in the stars. Now, the enlightened man saw only infinite space and silent planets. The heavens, once a choir, became a void. He had light, dazzling, rational light, but no warmth. Still, there was grandeur in this new clarity. To look through a telescope and glimpse Saturn's rings was to feel both small and divine. Humanity, fragile though it was, had learned to see the universe as it truly was, vast, mathematical, magnificent. And that, perhaps, was the Enlightenment's truest gift, not comfort but awe. Imagine a scholar in a candlelit study, quill scratching against parchment. Outside, carriages rattle over cobblestones. Inside, he writes words that will one day ignite revolutions: liberty, equality, reason. He believes, as so many did, that if men could only think clearly, they could live justly. But thought, like fire, does not stay contained for long. Across the Atlantic, colonies stir. Across Europe, kings grow uneasy. The philosophers' calm discussions begin to sound like gunfire in the distance. For once people begin to question the nature of truth, they soon question the nature of power. The Enlightenment, that gentle dawn of ideas, will soon blaze into revolution. But before that storm arrives, let us linger here a little longer, in the hush of an age that still believed knowledge could save the world. Listen, the faint scratch of pen against paper, the soft hiss of a candle burning low, the whisper of thought unfolding. The dream of reason is still sweet, still drowsy with hope. And as we close this chapter, the ink is barely dry. The next will be written not in words, but in blood. The Enlightenment had promised light, calm, reasoned, benevolent light. But light, when too bright, burns. By the late 18th century, Europe's quiet debates had kindled something fierce. The old order, kings, priests, inherited power, began to flicker. The air grew electric with a single, dangerous idea, that men could govern themselves. It began, as so many storms do, with words. Pamphlets, speeches, declarations, the paper kindled before the gunpowder. In America, colonists whispered of liberty, of natural rights, of freedom from distant crowns. In France, the whispers turned to shouts. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. 3 words that promised paradise, and opened the gates of chaos. Imagine Paris in 1789, hot, crowded, hungry. The air smells of bread and revolution. Crowds gather outside the Bastille, that hulking fortress of royal power, as if it were the very heart of tyranny itself. When the gates fall, so too does the illusion that kings rule by divine right. And just like that, centuries of order shatter. The age of reason had dreamt of perfect society, designed by logic and equality. But when theory meets hunger, theory bleeds. The guillotine, elegant, efficient, terrifying, becomes the dark symbol of enlightenment turned wrath. The philosophers had not imagined this. Voltaire's wit, Rousseau's fervor, Montesquieu's balance, all swept into a tide of blood and idealism. The world was remade, but at a terrible cost. And yet, amid the chaos, something irreversible took root. People no longer saw themselves as subjects, but as citizens. Power had left the palace and taken residence, however uneasily, in the crowd. Revolutions, once begun, are hard to contain. Across the Atlantic, America declared its independence and tested its new democracy, imperfect, experimental, but alive. Across Europe, others watched and wondered if they too could unseat their kings. The 18th century ended with crowns rolling and empires trembling. The world, once neatly arranged in divine hierarchies, now surged with human will. And standing amid the smoke of the French Revolution was a new kind of figure, small, brilliant, ambitious beyond measure, Napoleon Bonaparte. He rose like a spark from the embers, first a soldier, then a symbol. For all his genius and arrogance, he embodied the paradox of his age, that reason and ambition, liberty and conquest, could live in the same heart. He crowned himself emperor, a gesture so grand, so ironic, it might have made the old philosophers laugh or weep. The revolution had devoured its kings only to make a new one. Still, Napoleon carried the Enlightenment's ideals across Europe, even at sword point. He rewrote laws, reformed education, standardized everything from weights to justice. He marched reason into every court he conquered. And behind him came the modern world. But Europe, weary of war, eventually turned against him. The fire burned too hot. Waterloo ended his dream, and with him, the first great cycle of revolution. When the smoke cleared, the continent was changed forever. No one could pretend that history belonged only to kings anymore. The people, hungry, flawed, magnificent, had entered the stage. And yet, in victory came melancholy. The Enlightenment's faith in pure reason had met its limits. Human beings were not equations. They hungered, feared, loved, and fought not as ideals, but as creatures of flesh and memory. In the quiet after revolution, poets began to speak again. The age of rationality softened into the age of feeling, romanticism. They wrote of nature, of passion, of the sublime, the beauty that humbles, the sorrow that teaches. They painted stormy skies and heroic ruins, as if to mourn what reason had burned away. For perhaps every fire, no matter how noble, leaves behind shadows. Still, the dream endured. The revolutions had proven that history could change, that the world, once shaped only by gods and monarchs, could be rewritten by ordinary hands. The 19th century dawned not with a sword, but with a pen. Industry began to hum, trains stitched nations together, factories breathed smoke into the sky. Progress became the new religion. But that is the next story, the next rhythm of this long, restless lullaby of civilization. For now, imagine Paris at night after the revolution's end. The guillotine is silent, the streets washed clean by rain. A lamplighter moves slowly down the boulevard, his flame trembling in the wind. Somewhere, a child reads by candlelight, a book that begins with the words, "We the people." The fire of ideas has burned through palaces and prisons alike. Now, it waits to illuminate machines. Dawn comes not with birdsong, but with the whistle of steam. The 19th century wakes to a new rhythm, the clatter of gears, the hiss of pistons, the relentless pulse of progress. The world, once measured in heartbeats and harvests, now runs by clockwork. Factories rise like cathedrals of iron. Their windows glow at all hours. Day no longer ends at dusk. Inside, the air smells of coal and sweat, of oil and iron filings. Machines spin, hammer, grind. Men and women, faces soot-smudged and weary, move like parts within the greater mechanism. It is the age of industry, the transformation of everything familiar. The quiet countryside gives way to cities swollen with chimneys. Rivers run black. Horses vanish beneath the wheels of trains that scream through valleys, unstoppable, almost alive. The world has found a new god, the machine. And yet there is awe in it too. Imagine standing on a railway platform as a steam locomotive arrives, its breath a white cloud, its wheels singing against the tracks. It is terrifying and magnificent, a dragon harnessed by mathematics. Children cheer. Poets weep. Old farmers shake their heads and mutter that the world has gone mad. But the world does not listen. It moves forward, faster and faster. This is an age of invention, of telegraphs that carry messages faster than thought, of light bulbs that turn night to day, of engines that shrink the map of the world. The sea once divided continents, now it is crossed by steamships that carry goods, letters, and dreams. The earth itself seems smaller, more knowable, and yet, somehow, more mysterious than ever. People speak of progress as though it were destiny. But in the quiet corners of these new cities, progress hums with sorrow. Children work in mills. The poor huddle in brick tenements, coughing cold dust. The rhythm of life, once tied to the sun, now belongs to the factory bell. Still, amid the smoke, there are moments of startling beauty. Gas lamps flicker along cobblestone streets, their glow soft as candlelight. Train stations arch like cathedrals of glass and steel, filled with echoes and steam. Painters and poets try to capture the strange poetry of this new world, where romance and machinery entwine. The romantics mourn the lost simplicity of fields and forests, yet even they could not look away from the shimmer of the modern age. William Blake wrote of dark satanic mills, and yet, beneath his lament, there was awe too. The same fire that blackened the skies also lit the path to the future. Science, once a philosopher's pastime, became humanity's compass. Darwin published his theory of evolution, shaking the foundations of faith yet again. The earth, it seemed, was older than anyone had dreamed. Life was not ordained, but adapted, endlessly, fiercely, beautifully. Once more, certainty gave way to wonder. And as the century rolled on, humanity began to see itself anew, not as chosen, but as capable, not as divine, but as ingenious. Empires grew from this confidence. Britain, its flag carried by rail and steamship, spanned the globe. Goods from India, Africa, and the Americas filled the markets of London. Yet behind the grandeur of the empire's face lay the weary hands of those who built it, the colonized, the exploited, the unseen. History, ever rhythmic, repeats its dual refrain: creation and cruelty, progress and pain. And through it all, the machine keeps moving. There is something hypnotic about it, the steady turning of gears, the hiss of pressure, the rhythm of inevitability. Even now, as you listen, you can almost hear it: ch-ch-ch, tkk, ch-ch-ch, tkk, the lullaby of industry. For some, it is a dream of endless possibility. For others, a nightmare of endless toil. But for all, it is inescapable. The 19th century belongs to motion. Inventions breed inventions. Cameras capture time. Telegraphs connect continents. Steamships chase sunsets. And in the midst of it all, humanity, dizzy, awestruck, weary, begins to wonder what it has lost in the pursuit of power. Artists turn once more to feeling, to mystery, to beauty that machines cannot measure. The Impressionists paint light itself, fleeting and alive. Writers explore the human mind, its dreams, its guilt, its restless questioning. The Age of Iron gives birth to the Age of Introspection. And so, as the smoke thickens and the trains hum through the night, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of modernity, uncertain, curious, and strangely nostalgic for what we've only just left behind. Somewhere, in a workshop in Scotland or Germany, a new invention hums, something that will one day speak, record, and remember. Electricity crackles, whispering of miracles to come. But that, my dear listener, is for another dawn. For now, we linger in this twilight of soot and silver, a world both grim and glorious, where humanity learns to dream in metal. Outside the factory walls, snow begins to fall. It melts on the iron rails and turns to steam, vanishing into the night air. And there, amid the hiss and hum, the century exhales, proud, exhausted, and unaware that it is already being replaced by the next. The smoke clears. The machines quiet. The century exhales its last breath of steam. And the world, weary, wondrous, ever restless, turns once more toward the dawn. It is the end of the 19th century now, and the beginning of the 20th, that strange border where the old and the new briefly hold hands before parting forever. Cities glitter with electric light. Telegraph wires hum like invisible strings, carrying news, gossip, and promise. Photographs freeze moments that once slipped away like dreams. Voices travel through wires. Flight, once myth, flutters toward reality. The modern age arrives quietly, not with fanfare, but with the click of switches and the soft glow of bulbs. Humanity, for the first time, lives in its own light. And yet, beneath the brilliance, something ancient stirs, a familiar unease. Because every invention, every discovery is also a mirror. The more clearly we see the world, the more deeply we glimpse ourselves. And what we see is complicated: brilliance and cruelty, kindness and ambition, beauty and grief. The same engines that carry us forward can also carry us to war. The same reason that lifted us from superstition can make us forget wonder. The same progress that feeds us can hollow us out. It is always this way. History, like a tide, advances and retreats. Civilizations rise like waves, bright, strong, inevitable, and then fall back into the deep, leaving only shells and stories behind. But the stories remain. Perhaps that is what binds all ages together, from Cleopatra's Egypt to medieval Europe, from the Renaissance's radiance to the roar of industry. Each generation builds upon the last, dreaming that this time the dream will last forever. And yet each time, it fades, not as failure, but as renewal. For in the quiet after every ending, something stirs: curiosity, compassion, courage, and begins again. Imagine standing, just before dawn, on a hill overlooking a sleeping city. Below you, faint lights flicker in windows. Above, the first pale hint of morning. The world feels old and young at once. You can almost hear its heartbeat, slow, patient, eternal. The air smells of coal and rain, of smoke and spring. Somewhere, a factory whistle sounds and a bird answers. The new day is coming, and with it, another chapter no one yet knows. Cleopatra is long gone, her throne dust beneath the Nile. The medieval monks have laid down their quills. The Renaissance painters sleep beneath their frescoed ceilings. The philosophers' pens have dried, the engines cool in their sheds. And still, the story continues, told now in new tongues, written on new pages, dreamed in new minds. For history is not behind us. It sleeps inside us, waiting to be remembered. You wake slowly, as though rising through centuries. The sound of machines becomes the hum of your own breath. The rustle of parchment becomes the whisper of sheets. Outside your window, dawn stretches pale and gold across the world, Another day born from the ashes of 1,000 yesterdays. And somewhere, in the hush before morning truly begins, you smile, because you have traveled through history and returned home again.